Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Rennie Center's Condition of Education Community Conversation. My name is Alexis Leon, and I'm the Director of Policy at the Rennie Center. I'm thrilled to be joined today by my colleague, Annalise Bezade, the Rennie Center's Director of Research, as well as a distinguished group of education innovators, policymakers, and leaders as we dive into critical and complex questions together today. Before we dive in, I want to briefly ground us in the Condition of Education project. COE is one of the core ways the Rennie Center advances its mission to produce independent, nonpartisan research that helps improve public education for every child in the Commonwealth. Through the annual report, our data dashboard, and conversations like today's, COE is designed not just to describe where we are, but to help chart where we need to go. This year's report, From a Strong Foundation to a Stronger Future, Updating Massachusetts Learning Standards, comes at a critical moment. More than 3 decades ago, the Massachusetts Education Reform Act represented a bold, forward-looking response to a changing economy and society. It aligned standards, accountability, and opportunity around a shared vision of academic rigor and equity. And for a long time, Massachusetts has led the nation. But the world those standards were built for no longer exists. Today, technology, especially AI, is transforming how knowledge is both created and used. Careers are shifting faster than any single education pathway can keep up with. And at the same time, post-pandemic data shows widening gaps in achievement, engagement, and opportunity across the Commonwealth. Too many students, especially those historically underserved, are not experiencing school as a place that prepares them for a future of possibility. What's striking is this: almost no one is fully satisfied with the system as it currently stands. Families, educators, students, employers, and policymakers all see that something isn't working as it should. And that dissatisfaction, while deeply concerning, also creates a real opening, a moment for change that's not about small tweaks, but about reimagining what learning should look like for the next generation. Just like in 1993, we have an opportunity to be bold, not to build a system for the next few years, but to articulate a vision for the next few decades. So with that, I'm excited to turn it over to my colleague, Annalise, who will walk us through the research behind this year's report and the shifts that we believe are necessary to ensure that every student graduates with both strong academic foundations and the human skills to thrive in a rapidly changing world. I'll turn it to you, Annalise.
Thanks, Alexis, for that great intro. I'm so excited to be here today to get to share more about our report. So you can pop to the next slide, Alexis. And really, when we came to this topic this year, we landed in this place of the challenge with our standards right now being they're, as Alexis said, built for a time that no longer exists. So we have this paradigm in our education system of front-loading knowledge early in life and assuming what a student learns between preschool and post-secondary is going to carry that student through their career. And there's this real emphasis on building knowledge over this time. And we know that at this point, that's not what our students are going to need moving forward. So we're in this time when information is abundant, machines can generate that information instantaneously, analyze it faster than a human can. And so what distinguishes our students as they head out into the workforce and launch their careers is going to be different types of skills. Can they collaborate with others with different ways of thinking and design new solutions? Can they solve problems with creativity? Can they pivot? Can they get up to speed on new areas? Because we know reskilling and upskilling, that's just going to be part of the expectation for workers moving forward. And our standards need to be preparing our students for those things, to really learn how to learn anything that may not be taught to them in a classroom. That's going to be the expectation for someone who's going to thrive in their career. So we've really landed at this core problem because if you look at the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks, it's important to point out that the types of things we're talking about do actually live in our standards today. So we have practice standards across content areas. They talk about things like investigations in mathematics and in science and modeling with mathematics, these really deep inquiries. But very rarely when we visit schools and classrooms, although there's always exceptions to this, very rarely do we see the full meaning of these practice standards happening in our classrooms. And that's because there's just so much that our teachers, our schools are expected to cover in any grade level that it really crowds out the deep learning that we know will stick. So these um, components of learning that are meant to be a real deep inquiry into a particular area, it's often reduced to a word problem with a predetermined solution that feels pretty contrived to our students and doesn't hold a whole lot of meaning. So we're thinking about this as not something that we don't see existing at all in our standards today, but something that needs a whole lot more emphasis that we already see living within our standards today. So, what do our students need? When we did research on this topic, we really boiled down to three core pieces. We still need strong academic foundation. So, a strong foundation in literacy, strong foundation in numeracy, scientific reasoning. These things remain critical, and having a high bar in these areas remains critical because they're gateways to all future learning. You can't layer on new and more complex and more sophisticated skills in any area without this strong foundation. So certainly something we don't want to let go of. I already mentioned learning ability. So can our students learn new things independently? Do they have the confidence and the know-how to upskill and reskill throughout their lives, throughout their careers as new technologies emerge we can't even imagine today that require them to pivot, learn new things? And then critically important are these uniquely human skills. So there are things that our technology today can't replace. Creativity and critical thinking, emotional intelligence that will really be differentiators to ensure our students can thrive as they leave our classrooms and participate in civic life and in their careers. So how do we get there? This is what our report really dives into. We have three core shifts. I'll start right on the next slide just for the sake of time with shift one. So I'll talk through the three shifts in a moment here, but the first shift is identifying and prioritizing the most essential power standards. And the great news here is a lot of work has been done in our field to identify what power standards are. So these are the standards that students are going to need in their life beyond a single grade level. They're concepts that are going to apply across domains, across contexts, and they're the types of things that are essential to getting to the next level of understanding. So, for example, Algebra 1 skills are not going to make a whole lot of sense to someone if they haven't, at a younger age, really mastered this concept of fractions. So those types of things are the things we need to look at of, okay, if we're going to really zero in and move away from breadth and move in the direction of depth of learning, well, let's make sure we have these power standards covered that ensure students have this prerequisite knowledge for the next level of knowledge they're going to gain. Tons of work during the pandemic was done in this area. A number of states, organizations really did work to identify what these are. So there's great groundwork in this area in our field. And the next piece is thinking about our standards not as these fixed grade level frameworks, but as mastery grade based progression. So understanding how learning unfolds over time. We know that research tells us, and I will say more research is needed in this space of learning progressions, but it does tell us that specific milestones are reached in different developmental windows. And it's very normal for students to understand or really consolidate certain types of knowledge in different points of time. So not exactly, 6 months into third grade, but somewhere between age 7 and 9, foundational math fluency may really consolidate for a student. And what would it look like if we organized our standards in a way that allowed them to be placed in this mastery-based progression, better aligned with learning and science, and better aligned with what anyone who's ever worked in a classroom understands about learner variability. So that's the second shift you'll notice in our report is moving in the direction of those mastery-based progressions. And then the last piece is really the piece we're trying to get to, right? So in our opening, we talk about what our students are going to need in the workforce and really emphasizing these durable skills that are getting de-emphasized in our schools today. So like I said, it's not that they're not in our standards, it's that they're de-emphasized compared to just how critical these pieces are going to be. as our students head out into the workforce. So by organizing into the mastery-based progressions, by really zeroing on those power standards, we have the opportunity to elevate durable skills like critical thinking, creativity, and problem solving, helping students use their knowledge in meaningful and flexible ways, and taking really authentic problems and making learning meaningful in a way that students connect it to their lived experience and really can apply knowledge across disciplines. So the great news here as well is that a lot of our practice standards that exist right now, you can already find them in our Massachusetts curriculum framework. They're a great jumping off point to do exactly this work. And it's really about how do we elevate these things? How do we make these things more important, more critical to how teachers see their day-to-day job, to what we're measuring, assessing, what we really feel we care about in our education system. So implementation considerations are huge here because everything we've just talked about, these are not small tweaks. It's not tinkering around the edges. It's pretty significant changes. So the first piece is revising the standards in alignment with these three shifts, which would require both expert practitioners and then domain or subject matter experts coming together to to identify those power standards and determine how the standards should look moving forward. And then a next huge piece is our high quality instructional materials. So Massachusetts has made tremendous headway on high quality instructional materials in ways that are really good for students. And it's not an area that the state could afford to lose ground on. So one thing that would be critical is once these standards are in place and they're revised, be working with publishers or others to get some high quality instructional materials developed that are aligned to these revised standards. So we wouldn't be putting out standards that there weren't good materials on the market to support. And then the next exciting piece is that we already have schools, several schools in Massachusetts, and certainly many more across the country as well, that are doing this work already. So, in spite of how things currently look, they are doing all of the things we've talked about in these reports, and they can really serve as school design exemplars. So, folks don't need to go out there and figure it all out on their own. You'll hear from Chelsea Banks on our panel in Salem at the middle school level. They've done tremendous work on making learning look and emphasizing the types of skills we're talking about here. There are several other examples in Massachusetts, and really making sure we set up our system in a way that schools that are trying to shift in this direction that maybe haven't done as much of this work already have exemplars to look to. And then the last piece would be launching implementation with a targeted pilot. So the way we've proposed it in our report is thinking about a few schools or districts, just a couple of grade levels, and really doing intensive learning with them to see how is this going? What needs to be tweaked? Are the instructional materials the way they need to be? Do we have the training opportunities we need to have for our teachers, for our school leaders across our system? So really thinking about rollout as being a critical piece here. When you make sort of this magnitude of change, implementation needs to be at the forefront from the beginning. And that's something we talk about in our report as well. So I will hand it back to Alexis, who's going to move us into our conversation, but excited to hear more from the folks we have here with us today.
Awesome. Thanks, Annalise. As Annalise mentioned, we're going to bring these ideas into conversation with leaders who are living this work from different angles and perspectives, whether that's from district practice, system design, research, philanthropy. So it is my privilege to introduce our panelists today who will be joining Annalise for today's conversation. So we have Chelsea Banks, the Executive Director of Innovation and Learning from Salem Public Schools, Jessica Boston Davis, the Assistant Superintendent of Academics from Somerville Public Schools, and Natasha Ushamirski, the Senior Program Officer with Barr Foundation. So thank you everyone for joining us today. So let's start where Massachusetts has been strong. So Massachusetts is widely seen as a national leader in education with this unwavering commitment to strong academic standards. So where do you all feel the current system has been most effective? And as we start thinking about improving standards, what do we think is essential to preserve? So maybe, Jess, I'll toss it to you first to kick us off, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexis, and thank you for having me. Good to be here and in conversation with you all. I think I'll pick up with the spirit behind the standards, which Alexis, you just named, which is like this commitment to strong, rigorous academics. That spirit has to remain. I think there's a spirit behind the standards of if we set high standards for all students, then students should be able to meet those standards. And I think that also needs to remain. And I think about our standards, I think about coherence and consistency, and I think there was an attempt to get us there as well. I think about access, and there was an attempt to get us there. And when I say access, I mean, the standards were designed, and there are some systems in place with the standards that really aim to have all students, when they graduate, prepared either for post-secondary education or for the workforce, and they should all graduate any high school in the Commonwealth with being prepared to do those things. And so all of those ideas are wonderful and should definitely remain in however standards end up evolving in our state.
Awesome. Thank you. Chelsea or Natasha, want to hop in?
I'm happy to jump in. I think one way to think about this is to go back to 1993, right, when we passed the Massachusetts Education Reform Act, which was a big part of sort of the Massachusetts story to becoming a top performer in the country. And I think the thing that's really important to remember is that at that time, right, the state took the step of putting in place these expectations, high expectations for what students needed to know and be able to do. That was sort of one leg of a three-legged stool in that part of the legislation. The second leg was we also introduced measures, comparable statewide measures, to check whether kids were actually learning the things that the standards say they're supposed to learn. Right. And then the third leg of the stool was resources. At that time, too, the state dramatically increased investment in our public schools, directed that investment, especially to districts serving our highest need populations, in order recognizing that we need to be providing more support, more help to kids who might not be coming to our schools with the same level of advantage as in some of our zip codes. And so I think kind of remembering as we move into this next part of the journey, right? Remembering that this was a sort of three-pronged approach, not just a standards-focused approach, is going to continue to be really, really important.
Awesome. Thanks, Natasha. Chelsea, I think you're living this on the ground, so maybe if you can hop in with some thoughts there. Yeah.
Sure. I very much agree with what's been said so far, and I do think the spirit behind these standards and what the intent has been part of the reason that Massachusetts has been on paper doing so well in this country. I also think if you look below the hood on that of how that has played out, the tight correlation, as Natasha's talking about, to socioeconomic status in our state of how students are overall doing on those performance of those assessments and standards means that we've set a high bar and that we are doing work towards that bar, but we aren't always able to reach that for all of our students. And so I think that what we're gathered to talk about today is really about what is the most important essence of what that was brought to be, and how might we rethink how we do school so that we can get towards not only what the intention of the 93 reform was, but also it is a very different world than 1993, and how do we prepare our children for going forward? So I agree with everything that's been said so far and excited to dig into the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I think that was a great segue, Chelsea. So thinking about this, rethinking what school can look like. The report argues that the sheer volume of standards often pushes schools or educators toward coverage rather than mastery. And so how do you see from your perspective or your experience, how do you see this tension playing out in practice, if you do? And how does this affect students' ability to truly understand and apply what they learn? And maybe, Chelsea, I'll go back to you at first to start from that ground up perspective, and then maybe we'll go right back around the circle. That'd be great.
Thank you so much. And I do appreciate the shout out in the opening. We are trying to do a lot of this work in Salem Public Schools. And we work within the realities of the state of Massachusetts. So we do see this tension on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis because of that pressure for coverage. And I taught middle school science, and that idea that you have to cover all of these different standards within a school year. Are you really able to get into the essential questions and the science standards that go into critical thinking and problem solving and hypothesizing and testing? They stand in tension. And then they also stand in tension when you're trying to do interdisciplinary or project-based learning or community-based learning. How are we being as explicit as possible in tying relevance and connection and uh, critical thinking to what we're doing in classes? And so we have done our very best at the middle school here to be thinking about those as complementary and not a direct trade-off. But the reality is teachers have to make decisions of what to teach every day. And so the way that we've done that is really to add to what we do within the confines of the school day, the minutes that we have. And so we have a design class that is all practice standards. So all the standards that are assessed are across, I apologize, I do work in a school, that they are all practice standards assessed across content areas where students are facing real world challenges. They're using biomimicry right now to address sea level rise, ocean acidification, or temperature changes in order to design aquabots, as we call them, to solve the current situations where a harbor city of our oceans right outside. That is where they can apply that work, but it's only a 60-minute class every other day right now. And we are still teaching a core content science and a core content math and ELA that goes with it, even though we're trying to apply those standards in this design class. And so if we could move to a space that allowed us to elevate the application of the content and really go into those focus standards, I think it would open up more teachers to be more creative and collaborate to figure out how to bring those kinds of principles into their classrooms every day and not necessarily feel like in one place we're doing a set of work that is very aligned to discrete standards, and in another place we're doing interdisciplinary critical thinking work. We very much think that those are mutually reinforcing, and we have seen results that do help those students move forward in both spaces by doing this work together. But it would transform what we're able to do and how we're able to think about all the time that we have with students and all the things that we do if we were able to prioritize and streamline and think interdisciplinary as the report recommends. It would just that shift one, I think, would be really exciting for us and what would be able to do as students.
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsea. Maybe Jess would love to hear from your perspective at the district as well, how you see, if you see that tension playing out.
Definitely. First of all, totally agree with and am excited by some of the work that Chelsea, you shared you're doing. I'm going to call you after this and see what's going on in Chelsea, but also hear that tension, and it's very real in Somerville as well. And with teachers that I talk to that work in other districts, is just like the number one thing is we don't have the time to do everything. We don't have the time to just cover everything that needs to be covered. I think I also related to what Chelsea just spoke about. There's a desire to do some real, like authentic project-based learning. We have a couple of schools diving very deeply into that, but that tension is real. With that does come the interdisciplinary connections, but there are limitations to that. And so the learning, the projects that many of our very creative and talented educators, things that got them excited about going into teaching, there are limitations to what they're able to do, trying to cover everything, trying to do everything. The other thing that I'll add, and just to connect to our first question, I really appreciated the three-legged stool kind of framework to think about this and kind of not think about one in isolation, because how we measure standards, what gets measured and how we measure them ultimately will drive teaching and learning. And so there is a pressure that even though I want to do this rich learning experience that ultimately I think students may have a deeper understanding, I know that they're going to be things are going to be measured in this way. And by the way, I'm not just talking about through standardized assessment. That is a consideration, but it's not the only way. But any way we measure, that drives the way teachers teach and what we measure. So if we're measuring everything because we may feel like we have to, that does limit, instruction. The final thing I'll say on this before I pass it is just, I also want to name, as we think about the time constraints, that right now I feel like we're talking really around tier 1 or generally what every student gets. And then that becomes limitations for when students need a little bit more support, how our systems allow for the flexibility to provide that. And trying to cover everything becomes a real tension in that as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jess, for that. Natasha or Annalise, any reactions or want to hop in with anything that's been said?
No, just fully agree. Everything that's been said so far resonates deeply. I will say too, I was thinking back I had an opportunity to attend a student summit, which is something that this kind of way of listening to students that BAR has supported through some of our work with districts. And sitting as part of the summit, there were student groups that were kind of groups of students who were sitting together talking about what was and wasn't working for them in their schools. And the rest of us got to sit on the outside and listen, right? It's such a deeply valuable learning experience. And one of the students said, I come in the morning, I just woke up, I'm tired. I sit down in my classroom and the teacher goes and turns off the lights and puts up a slide deck. And somehow I'm supposed to stay awake through this, right? And that kind of sort of lecture-focused teaching, I think, is also something that educators often feel pressure to default to, given just the quantity of content that they have to cover. It's not the only way to cover content, to be clear, right? Like there are flexibilities and approaches and so forth, but there is a very clear kind of incentive to get through the stuff when there is so much stuff to get through that the kind of sort of depth and creativity that Jessica and Chelsea alluded to are harder to introduce.
That definitely jives, Natasha, with what I heard in some of the interviews, and I've been able to meet with folks as part of this process. A couple things that stand out is teachers feeling like, even though this is not what they want to be doing, that they're teaching students how to find the right answer rather than teaching students how to learn. And then that makes them nervous if we are heading into this world where knowing how to learn, knowing how to pick up new things is going to be so critical. It's not what many teachers feel like they're doing right now. And then they're also feeling, and I think we've certainly heard more and more of this since COVID, of like getting students excited about learning takes a certain type of teaching. Like, right, you're referring to Natasha, and they're feeling like this, you could do real meaningful inquiries in social studies that help students understand how things that happened in the past shape what they're seeing right in their community today. And it really, these types of things make students really come alive and feel really motivated to learn. And, I've heard teachers say we feel like we could do that like one time a year, but you can't be doing that all the time because the time just isn't there for that.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, and I think to Annalise, your point earlier, kind of to segue into maybe Natasha, your student perspective, which I think is really important. Annalise, you mentioned how as we talk about student development, not every student develops according to their exact grade level that they happen to be at throughout the school year. And so the report calls for moving from these fixed grade level expectations to a more mastery-based progression. This is a big shift to how our education system is currently set up. So for anyone here, what are the potential drawbacks to that shift? And how do we, if we can, support differences in student development readiness while also advancing equity across student groups? And maybe Chelsea, I'll turn it to you first, and then we can go around again.
Sure. And I think this does tie back to the original conversation we were having about the standards themselves. That for me, part of the risk or part of the aspiration with the standards as put in place were to make sure that every student was getting access to quality and rigorous education, as we've said. When we think about moving to mastery-based work in schools, the flip side of that could be a practice that most of us have tried to really make sure isn't happening in schools around ability grouping. And so how that practice is implemented and who is assessing and what those assessments look like to determine mastery become really important to ensure that there are not underlying inequities that are proving out in how this is implemented and who's being seen as having that genius that shows up in different ways and who's being missed in that chance. And so I do think the opportunity myth from TNVP did point out a really important piece of what standards showed us about where the bar should be and what was being presented to students in classes, and that actually our students were much more ready for much more rigor than we were even giving them access to in many places, including in particular high need schools that served disproportionately students who were not getting access to what they deserved. And so in that shift, I think the mastery-based shift too in this work is takes a level of skill and care in order to ensure that that is taking place, predominantly if it is going into multiple grades. And so it is like thinking about how we might prioritize or streamline to focus on practice standards and what are the standards themselves, to me is one set of shifts and creativity to schools. There's a second set of shifts to me around thinking about undoing the grade system, which in my heart, I love and I want to be part of thinking about how kids move more based on their own readiness for learning. And I think the guardrails and safety, like the mechanisms that go with that, take a lot of skill and care to ensure that that does not play out in a way where some kids get access to acceleration and others don't, or assumptions are made about any of our children and what they're capable of doing. And so I think if we do them together, where we're really focused on these durable skills and creative problem solving and figure out how to measure for that or look for that, and we allow kids to move at their own ability, then we can put together something that's really incredible and what students deserve and need. And I think how we do that and how it plays out, and I'll just name in that process that teacher quality and the reason we are in an HQIM, a high quality instructional materials world, is because my mother looked at me when I was a first year teacher and said I couldn't possibly be the best person to figure out what to teach every day. Because I was in a place in a school, not in Massachusetts at the time, that I didn't have access to curricular materials. And so it was really up to me to figure those out. And so the movement towards having high quality instructional materials has been very important to ensure that kids have equitable access to those grade level opportunities. And that can then, in this future world, it could look different about how they do that or what kind of time they take on different subjects or where they're ready and where they're not ready. It just runs a great risk depending on implementation and teacher quality in that process. So how do you make sure a first year teacher is able to do that at the same skill and quality and ability for the children in front of them as a master teacher who really understands this and has been actually doing this probably in some places and spaces in schools, even within the confines of our current system. And so those are the kinds of things that I think about with that larger shift and thinking about rethinking how we do seat time and grade levels, which are very exciting to me. And at scale and as a system, how do we ensure that that happens in a way that honors and celebrates every one of our children and doesn't leave any of them out of that option?
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsea. And maybe from where you left off, you mentioned like the system level. Jess, maybe I'll turn it to you from your perspective at kind of the district level. Where are you seeing any potential drawbacks or like where that tension might live, trying to really scale this if we're going to go in that direction?
Yes, thank you. Once again, I really agree with the points that have been made. This is the piece that makes me a little bit worried about how we would execute this. In the vision, I agree with. The principles, the spirit behind this, I agree with. In execution, it worries me a bit for the reasons that have been named. And as we think about building a strong system, so there's often like, exemplars and pockets of really strong practice and in scale, or as we think about across a district or across the Commonwealth, that's where things get challenging. Because context is different, people are different, and all those considerations would need to be put in play. So I would there's a couple of considerations that I would think about as we think about a system. The first is that, and again, this is really restating a lot that's already been said or sharing similar perspectives to what has already been said. The first is that, we can change a technical system. And I think we have, again, pockets, schools. I know of a couple of really strong Montessori schools that do a similar philosophy. But as we think about a whole system, shifting a technical structure does not necessarily shift a large amount of, the status quo. I would want to be very thoughtful that this does not recreate at least, but exacerbate the disparities that we already see. How are we ensuring, especially across different lines of race, lines of, English acquisition status, socioeconomic status, special education status? How are we ensuring that certain groups aren't put in the not developmentally there yet category, even by our most skilled and masterful educators, but through a different system? And other students are placed in the, oh yeah, you've got this, you can succeed. So I think the piloting would be important, but the scale is what I worry about, because I don't know if we have strong examples of transformational system scale. We think about disrupting, opportunity gaps and achievement disparities in pockets. And then when we try to scale, we still see some of those, the status quo being recreated. So that there's a nervous piece there as I think about, again, by principle, I think this is a great direction to start moving in. It would take a lot of resource. It goes back to that stool. It would take a lot of resource to make sure that we have the skills and are equipped to lead this charge. Our leaders know how to look and support educators in this work. And I would just want to make sure the flexibility that this is discussing does not result into lowering expectations for any of our kids. So those are some of the potential challenges with moving something like this forward.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, those are, thank you for raising that. And I think, Annalise, I might tap you in quickly to respond here, because I think we ran into a lot of those challenges when doing this research. So maybe I'll turn it to you quickly to go through that.
Well, I think, I sort of heard from you, Jess, like if you were going to go in this type of direction, it would have to be done with great care. And I would say that is certainly what we found in doing some research behind this. And one thing that definitely came up was there are areas of kind of the literature we have out there where we have a pretty good understanding of the learning progression. So the need to tie something like this to like real milestones, like if a student is not doing something by age 9, by age 7.5, like really understanding this is what developmental science tells us about how these skills unfold is critical. And there are areas where that research is strong, and there are areas where that research is much weaker. And I think part of it is really being able to tie into that and saying, okay, we're not going to let anyone with this kind of what can look like more flexibility, we're not going to let anyone fall off track. And I think one of the best examples we have is in early literacy development. We've all heard sort of reading by the end of third grade, but it's not like, oh, suddenly by the end of third grade, you're assessing reading and you hope the child's there. There are all these other skills along the way. Like we know 6-year-olds should be demonstrating some phonemic awareness, some of that letter sound correspondence, and how can we tie in a progression like this so that in our system we really understood when we knew when we needed to act and not waiting to say, oh, well, now we're at the end of this progression and Annalise isn't reading like she should be, but actually, no, we're seeing this like her as a 6-year-old as needing some more support here. And I think for something like this to work, it really needs to be closely tied with that research on how learning unfolds to not fall into these equity pitfalls like, both of you just described very clearly.
Very much agree with everything that's been said so far, and definitely my mind went in the same direction of what are the equity implications of this type of shift, right? And I think one thing we have to remember is our systems, our schools function the way that they were designed. And one of the ways that they were designed historically was literally to sort kids by ability. We don't call it tracking until middle school, but really it starts with the ability groupings very, very early on, right? If that was entirely objective, that would in itself be problematic, potentially, but it's also not. This is where educators are human. This is where things like biases, conscious or unconscious, can come up, right? And really sort of, again, as Jess mentioned, when we're talking about differences along between educators and students, or between students along lines of race, class, disability status, English learner status, etc. All of those things can play into these decisions. And what I would be afraid of, just to be really blunt, is if this is not done super well, are we signing ourselves up for a tracking on steroids? And what do we need to do in order to avoid that and to ensure that this kind of shift is having the impact that it's intended, which I also totally agree with, right? In an ideal world, you would very closely monitor every child's learning progression. You would provide the kids who might need some additional support with that support early on. You'd make sure that kind of learning concepts are building and skills are building on each other. And yet, right, what we could wind up with is sort of sending kids down very, very different paths. And so we need, in addition to the knowledge and the careful implementation, I think this is another place where guardrails are going to be really important. And that might look like essentially not necessarily grade level, maybe age. I don't know what the right sort of point in time is, but sort of uniform checks on learning as well that are, again, comparable, standardized across the state, so that you can double check that as you're trying to scale up practice, that scale up is going successfully in different schools, districts, and so forth.
Might I add one thought, Alexis? And again, appreciate and agree with everything that's been stated. As we were having this conversation, I thought about, I told you that, this one kind of brought up a feeling in me. I almost had a physical, like, I'm nervous about this reaction. But one thing I appreciate about the report is pushing us to think about what could be possible centering the student experience. So I think it is a natural and probably good reaction that we are like, consider all of these things that could happen, and we have to be thoughtful and do with skill and care, as my colleague from Chelsea shared. So I really appreciate that. And if this does go well, think about what could be for our children's experience. So I just want to share that my feelings haven't changed. There's still that nervousness in my stomach as I think about this, but I do appreciate the push to imagine what could be possible. I was not yet in education in '93 when the standards were introduced, but I wonder what the leaders thought when those standards were put into place. I wonder if there was a similar, maybe, different concerns, but if there was a similar reaction from people who sat in the role that I sit in right now. And so I just want to name that because I do appreciate it. And still, at the same time, we do have to hold up the thoughtfulness that we're urging around this, because otherwise we could recreate and maybe even exacerbate problematic systems.
I really appreciate that, Jess. So, and totally agree. I think in some of our conversations, and Annalise can probably agree here, with people who were very much in those conversations in '93, there was a pretty visceral reaction to some of these conversations. And I think that's a really good point to bring up, that at least at the Rennie Center, we're attempting to push on those boundaries a little bit to say, small incremental tweaks, it may not be the time for that right now, and it might be time to get ahead of things a little bit more boldly. So I appreciate the feelings on both ends of the spectrum, and hopefully that means we're moving in a good direction here, and hopefully we'll figure that out together. So I'm just going to do 2 more questions because we are running up on time here. We've talked a lot about academic core in our conversations with employers across the state, even from some of our students. We've heard a lot about durable skills. Some call it by another name, life skills, things like problem solving, adaptability, communication, collaboration. Oftentimes from employers, when we asked them what they were looking for in hiring, that was the first answer that we heard from all of them. So in balancing all of these priorities, all of the things that we ask educators to do, what are your thoughts on how we put a stronger emphasis maybe on some of those more durable skills that are becoming increasingly valuable in both the workplace and in our students' lives? So how do you see the system needing to kind of balance both of those things, if it's possible from your perspective? And maybe Natasha, I'll come to you first if you have any thoughts.
So I think the first thing that I will say is this goes far beyond employers, right? This is when we do focus groups with parents, we observe focus groups with parents or students, they're naming those same things as the things that are most important to them and the things that they worry about for their kids. I will also say, and this might be a little bit naive, so forgive me, and I will certainly eager to hear what Chelsea and Jessica add. But I don't see the contradiction necessarily. I'm struggling with the sort of bifurcation here, right? Because one, you can have whatever content expectations you want to have. There's also the how of the learning. And to me, a lot of those durable skills come across in the how. Now, creating space for that, our strongest educators already weave these 2 things together and they do it seamlessly. Not everyone has gotten the type of support, preparation, or, to be able to do that. And so to me, the question is more about how do we learn from the educators who are weaving the 2 and then scale that parallel to any changes in content expectations.
Chelsea, want to hop in as a response there?
Sure. I definitely think that what Natasha's getting at, that our strongest educators are teaching the durable skills and getting at us through the how, is absolutely true. And I think in the majority of classrooms, teachers feel the pressure to make sure that they're moving forward without taking the time. And Zaretta Hammond has a new book out this summer about rebuilding students' learning power. And the 2 things that really stuck with me that really speak to this conversation as well are the skill of a teacher to shift a learner from a dependent to an independent learner. So what we really want to be sending out into the world are students who are able to learn on their own, is a level of skill and craft in the teaching profession that goes beyond, I think, what our current content standards are asking students to be able to demonstrate. And so I think as we think about those practice standards, or as we think about what we're going to be focusing on, I think really understanding and helping teachers understand how to build those skills in students for independence and learning how to learn takes time. And if you feel like you can't take the time to go deep and write a full essay, or to go into a project, or to help students build not only the executive functioning skills, but actually like the rationalization and problem solving of what do I do when I get stuck, and how do I find answers, and how do I actually think about the learning process? What I'm seeing in classrooms more often is this push towards that next benchmark assessment, or the need, and it's coming from a place of teachers feeling that they're failing children if they're not giving them access to the standards that haven't been taught yet. And so that tension that we talked about at the beginning around time, I think, is also showing up in exposure versus depth of learning, and really that learning how to learn. I'm still learning this. I'm still going deeper into the brain science behind this, but I do think it comes into things that we are still developing our own knowledge about how to evoke that from students, and how to really empower students to own their learning and not have it be teacher led at all. And that piece, I think, would be a major shift in what we see in our schools. And there are schools doing this, there are classrooms doing this, but that is where I hope that this goes. And that focus on the durable skills is really about students entering a world that we know we can't actually prepare them for. So the skill set that they need to be prepared is really about how to adapt and learn and build that curiosity, no matter what they're faced with or what it is that they're asked to do in the future. And that piece of learning how to learn or that building independence, I just don't see in the content standards that we're currently working with. And so it's just not being reached in so many of our classrooms. And I do think that that does come down to where we're seeing students. It is showing up on our current MCAS tests is they're not meeting proficiency, but why they're not meeting proficiency is not because they're not getting access to the coverage of material. It's because they can't apply it and own it on their own and drive it forward, without that skill set that's not present in what I'm seeing today.
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsea. Jess, anything to add?
No, I think Chelsea said that very well, and agree with Natasha in terms of not these don't have to be separate conversations. In fact, they should have been together. But yeah, I agree with my colleagues here.
Awesome. All right, for sake of time, we are going to do a last like rapid response question. So, and hopefully ending on like a little bit of optimism. So to close our conversation today, I want to try and paint a picture of what could be possible. Whenever we talk about some of the bigger vision stuff that we talk about, just to your point, it's from the think tank world, it's like, great, yeah, this is lovely. For people who actually have to implement this, it's like, yeah, but how am I actually going to do this? So to try and connect those two worlds a little bit, what I want to do is to take a moment to think about what would getting this right look like from your perspective 10, 15 years from now. So in the same way that the 93 Ed Reform Act was an attempt to kind of get ahead of itself for a few decades, and it can be one word, it can be a sentence, however you want to respond, or an image, whatever you see. What, from your perspective, would getting this right for students in the next decade or two look like to you? And anyone can hop in when they're ready.
One piece that sticks out to me is really simple, but if we walked in classrooms and there was a real tangible feeling that teachers were excited to teach and the kids were excited to learn and they were motivated by what they were learning, I would say we've done a really good job at that point.
My hesitation is that I'm working in a district right now that is building, like we are doing this conversation as a district. So we have a 10-year vision process underway to try to figure out for Salem what the answer to this question should be. And so I only have drafts or ideas, but we're listening to our community in this process. And I do think it is about seeing students owning learning and able to learn and driving themselves forward in that process. And so that can look like some of our brilliant Montessori classrooms or early learning classrooms where kids are exploring today. But I think at the middle and upper grades, that is a bigger shift towards students' ability to take in new information, to apply their thinking, to ask questions and find out answers, so that then when they enter the world and to use all of the tools that are being built at their fingertips, to be able to figure out what to do and how to do it, and to be able to apply it in whatever way that they want to, without any of the risks that made Jessica nervous, that I very much agree with, coming true at a system scale. So it would be very exciting to see, and I think we're trying to figure out those answers here in Salem too.
I'll add, I appreciate the student-centered perspective. So adding something, I would start with that. And I'll add that I'm going to go back to what Natasha said to start. And that is, if this were to be true, I would hope that there were measures and resources in place that really support a coherent system that, again, continues to hold high expectations with high support for students.
I think I'm going to loop back to the student perspective. I think one of the things that research has shown in recent years is students know whether they're having good learning experiences or just kind of average, mediocre, not so good at all learning experiences, right? They express that through surveys. They expect that they relay that in focus groups. I would argue they also communicate that through their attendance. When they can vote with their feet, they do that too. So what I would hope to see, I would want students to be telling us that they love the learning that they are experiencing in their schools, that they are finishing school, finishing their high school experience, feeling prepared for a maximum range of choices that they want to pursue and just for life in general. That they have had the opportunity to learn more about themselves and learn more about others' experiences. Um, and just feel ready to thrive, right? As people. Um, this conversation, this goal is about much more than just standards, to be clear, right? And this is all about adaptive change, not about any kind of technical shift. But I think, and I think, frankly, for those of us who are trying to influence the system too, we're kind of working in the. I come from an advocacy background before I was at Bar. Really think about. The things we measure, I firmly believe we need to continue to measure the types of student outcomes we have been measuring. That is absolutely critical, but also emphasizing asking young people about their experiences and getting their input and building that into kind of what we do and kind of basing what we recommend on what they tell us is and isn't working for them, I think is also absolutely key.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. So this has been a really rich and thought-provoking discussion. I really appreciate you all being here to discuss this today. To our audience, I think it's clear that the task ahead is not simple, but as we've heard today, it's essential and change is possible. So at the Rennie Center here, our hope is to offer a roadmap, but it's up to all of us, the folks on the call today, but all of you as well, to ask the hard questions and embrace these bold ideas and take collective action that is really needed to build a school system, an entire system that truly prepares students for their future. So thank you for joining us, and let's continue this important work together. Thank you so much.